Hello, and thank you all for joining us for Conversations at MOCA. I am so excited to host this powerhouse of panelists with us. My name is Amanda Kovach. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Curator of Education here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami. For all of us who are joining via the webinar, please feel free to use the chat and to, participate in any conversation that you'd like to in the chat. We do have our events and programs coordinator to monitor the chat as well. Also, if you have any issues hearing us, please feel free to post it in the chat as well. Before proceeding, MOCA acknowledges that we stand on the current and ancestral home of the Seminole and Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. We further acknowledge the Calusa, Yaega, Miami, and Tequesta peoples, all historic caretakers of this land. We honor and thank them for their past, present, and future stewardship of Southern Florida. MOCA North Miami's exhibitions and programs are made possible with the generous support of the North Miami Mayor and Council and the City of North Miami and the Miami-Dade County Department of Cultural Affairs. We also want to thank our Board of Trustees, our corporate and foundation partners, and our members. We extend a heartfelt thanks to all of you for your meaningful support. I also wanted to let you know that this exhibition was just recently featured in Art Loft. The link for that recording will be available in chat. And we also have a link for closed captions for any of us who are hard of hearing to tune into the closed captions for this webinar. I want to start off by introducing our panelists. Allison Jindross is a curator and writer based in New York and Warsaw. Gingeras has served as a curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the National Museum of Modern Art, the Centre Pompidou Paris, Palazzo Grassi, Venice. Currently, she serves as an adjunct curator at the Dallas Contemporary and a guest curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, in addition to working independently. Piotr Slodkowski is the assistant professor at the Academy of Fine Art in Warsaw, author of the book Modernism in Jewish Polish Modernism. His studies on strength were awarded prizes by the Polish Art History Association in 2018, the Political Weekly in 2019, and Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw in 2020. The co-editor of Czas Debat, Antologia, Time of Debate, an anthology of Polish art and criticism. Here I am trying to read in Polish, in 1945 and 1954. His research focuses on Polish interwar art as well as art after 1939, especially on methodological approaches towards alternative modernisms and complex relations between the Holocaust, modernism, engaged art, and socialist realism. Noah Rosenberg is curator of modern art and former associate curator of Israeli art at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, TAMA. A researcher and lecturer at the Ben-Gurion University of Negev, her research centers on three themes: the Holocaust as the central instance of modernity, multiple modernities, focusing on national models in visual culture and print media in Egypt, Turkey and Palestine/Israel in the first half of the 20th century, and the history of the Tel Aviv Museum during 1929 to 1936 through cross-referencing national readings of Arab Jaffa, Palestine, the British Mandate, and the Jewish community in pre-state Palestine. Rosenberg has curated exhibitions dealing with nationality and contemporary Israeli identity, including Tamir Sadak, A Guide to the Arab World, and exhibitions of modern Israeli artists who worked outside of the local canon, such as Hajit Lalo, a painter who begins at the end. in addition to curating and producing many other exhibitions, events, and projects. She is currently co-curating with French curator David Rosenberg a forthcoming exhibition titled, Hey, Did You Know That Art Does Not Exist? Works from Silvio Perlstein's collection, and writing and editing a research anthology to be published in honor of TAMA's 90th anniversary in April of 2022. Noah Rosenberg is also the co-curator of the Traveling exhibition, My Name is Marianne. And finally, but not least, Luna Goldberg is a Miami-based independent curator and currently serves as the education manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Wilsonian FIU. Her research focuses on global contemporary art and identity politics, and with an emphasis on Israeli art. She is the recipient of a Wavemaker grant, an Ellie Creator Award, and a Fulbright Fellowship to Israel. Goldberg has curated exhibitions and programs in partnership with Artistes Contemporary, the Norton Museum of Art, Detroit Art Week, and the Sullivan Galleries. Her latest exhibition, At Memory's Edge, considers contested monuments and is on view at the Fundación Pablo Achiburi, Miami through February 5th. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can start everybody's videos. Thank you all for joining us today. Really, when we ideated this conversation, I was really thinking about how Marianne's story and history related to the larger diaspora of Jewish travel. And I really thought that by pulling each one of you into this conversation, we could get this little glimpse of a world, of a culture, of a community that's been created through Marianne's timeline. So with this idea, and I just wanted for everybody to see your faces really quickly. So with this idea, I wanted to get started with Allison for you to give us a sort of a non-formal introduction to Marianne and to his work as well.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone at MOCA and my colleagues who are here with us today. I should say that in a way, our seminar today prefigures the catalog because both Piotr and Noah will be contributing essays on the catalog that we're currently working on. So I'm going to keep my introductory remarks quite brief because I hope that we can have a almost like chronological discussion where we can discuss Marianne's trajectory. So Marianne, who was born Pinkas Burstein in southern Poland in a small town called Nowy Sącz, which is about an hour away from Krakow. He was born into an observant Jewish family, a very working class family. He had from his own accounts in the drawings that we have that he made towards the end of his life. He had a very happy childhood, and his father was a baker and his mother was a homemaker. He had brothers and sisters, and the exhibition, which I hope many of you will have seen or maybe experienced online, tells Marianne's story as an artist and also just as a person, and this kind of somewhat emblematic diasporic experience. His experience, we don't encounter it in the exhibition in a chronological way, but for the purposes of today's discussion, I think we should speak about his life in a chronological manner. So after his imprisonment and his miraculous survival in Auschwitz, Marianne spends some time in Częstochowa in Poland recovering from his injuries, and then ultimately winds up going to then Palestine to start his life and his career as an artist in the late 1940s, and ultimately leaves Israel, goes to Paris in 1950, where he goes to the École des Beaux-Arts and does his studies and really begins his career in earnest. And by 1962, he leaves France to immigrate to New York, to America, living in New York. So I won't go into depth about that because I think we should turn the discussion over to Piotr, who can give us a more precise situation of Marianne's early years and his, I think, a very studied or at least discussed subject of the kind of Polish Jewish community in pre and post-war Poland. And then Noah will speak to us. And then maybe I can chime in a little bit after we discuss his Israeli period. So Piotr, please, I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Alison. I'm very honored to be here with all of you. Thank you very much. And let me start with some general remarks on a, let's say, methodological level, because the eminent scholar of the art from non-Western parts of the world, Professor Piotr Piotrowski, left us with a wise lesson. Namely, he wrote that similar art forms mean very different things in different regions of the world. And I believe that the same is true for artists' biographies. Of course, we all know that knowledge is always situated. Knowledge is always situated, and therefore it is not irrelevant that I speak from Warsaw, Poland, and Central Europe. And speaking from this particular perspective, as Alison noted, I would like to briefly present Marianne's cultural roots, background, and show him as a member of the community of Polish Jews and Holocaust survivors. Can we please share my presentation? It should be available now. Amanda?
I believe Gina has it. Just 1 second, please.
Okay, yes. Because I believe it would be helpful for our audience. So I will continue. The important factor is that many artists of Jewish origin who have who have entered the canon of Polish modern art belonged to Polonized families from interwar Poland's large cities. And it's exactly the case of the prominent and very important avant-gardists like Henryk Berlewi, who was a crucial part of Polish constructivism, or Henryk Stręk, later known as Marek Włodarski. In contrast to them, Marian, then known as Pinkas Bursztyn, or in Polish pronunciation Bursztyn, was raised in a practicing Jewish family in Nowy Sącz. As Alison told us, it is a small town in eastern Galicia. I think there is an issue with this presentation, yes?
Yeah, she's not able to share the screen. I don't know if you're able to try.
Yeah, I can try, of course. I can try do it from my desktop. One moment, please, because I need to open it in my computer, but it should work. It should work now. Okay, please let me know if you get it.
Perfect. We can see it now, Piotr. Thank you so much.
So not a problem at all. So here's Marian and his birth certificate with this Polish Pinkas Simon Bursztyn name. So as I said, Marian, there is a set of important Polish Jewish artists, as I mentioned, Polonized artists like Henryk Stręk or Henryk Berlewi, and Orthodox or traditional backgrounds. It's the case of Marek Oberlander here, and of course Marian. So, as I said, he lived in Nowy Sącz. For example, the important historian Emanuel Ringelblum also grew up here. The town, however, was famous among religious Jews, mostly because of the achievements of Chaim Halberstam, an outstanding rabbi and tzaddik who founded the Hasidic science dynasty that promoted Orthodox teaching of the Torah. Although Burstein himself was not Hasidic, this must have had a general impact, definitely, on his formative cultural background as he grew up in the Jewish neighborhood in the Piekło district, Piekło, English hell, at Lwowska Street. And this was the most impoverished part of the town center, as known for the very poor sanitary conditions, among any things. What is important is the fact that at the time when Marianne was born, Galicia was home of the most numerous Jewish diaspora in the world. And in the interwar period, the Jewish minority continued to form a significant portion of the population of this town, as they managed to maintain its political or religious autonomy. Members of Jewish community largely worked at trades and as merchants. As Alison told us, Marianne's father was a baker, and it was a very typical situation. Nevertheless, the Jewish population of Nowy Sącz was highly diverse. And this is the social fact that I would like to understand, to underline very much, because it's also very typical to plenty of Polish communities, small communities of Polish Jews. It's that diversity. Diverse in terms of political outlook, economic standings, or cultural backgrounds. In fact, from Orthodox organizations like Ugudas Israel to socialist and communist cells or supporters. So the big question is, how did this diversity of life in Nowy Sącz, in Polish small Jewish community, translate into Pinka's cultural background? Given his family's social position, it is more likely that he was exposed to so-called amateur or folk art more than so-called high culture. Evidence suggests that in childhood he showed interest not only in fine arts, which is important thing, but also in theater. And theater was very popular in the town. In fact, many professions like workers and soldiers formed their own theater groups. And this kind of low culture, popular culture, was often centered around the Purim holiday, which involved a variety of performances and joyful dancing. Purim was a grateful subject of art, not only here, but across the country in Poland. For example, it was important theme for the young Yiddish group, avant-garde Jewish group operating in Łódź, which is a very, very big city in the center of Poland. And young Yiddish wanted to reflect the essence of Jewish traditions by means of a modern artistic form. Purim also strongly influenced theatrical aesthetics in Galicia and had a lasting impact of the motifs Maryan used in his later work. I don't want to talk too long, but finally, let me just briefly go through Marianne's wartime experiences, because I believe it's crucial for our panel. So the most basic but terrifying facts. In 1946, Burstein's family left Nowy Sącz for another small town, Dębica, around 100 kilometers away. And the man who became the artist known as Maryan would never return to his hometown. It's also very typical for biographical trajectories of Polish Jews. As one can read in the calendar of artist's life, I quote, September 1939 marked the beginning of the family tragedy. When the German army invaded Poland on September 1st, 12-year-old Pinkas, together with his parents, older sister and younger brother, moved to Baranów. Later in May 1940, the family was separated. Pinkas never saw his mother and his siblings again. During the war, he was a forced labor in Biesiadka in 1941, before being placed in the Rzeszów ghetto in 1942, a forced labor camp in Pustków the following year, and the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp in 1944, before finally landing in a camp in German Gliwice, Polish Gliwice, in 1944-45, from where he was sent to a death march to Blachownia in Opole, it's Silesia region in Poland. Important thing is his migration experience did not end with the end of the war. He ended in a hospital in Częstochowa in 1945-1946, followed by a displaced persons camp in Germany, before going to Haifa, finally going to Haifa in May 1947. Just to sum it up, Marian never returned to the country of his birth, and this is an experience quite typical for many Polish Jews. Indeed, the history of communist Poland was marked by several waves of emigration. Just after the war, in the mid-50s, and probably the most important and the biggest one in 1968. And I will stop here, but if we have enough time later, I will point to some visual testimonies of the Holocaust by other Polish Jewish artists that I believe correspond with Marian's early work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Piotr. I think that is ideal to really look through and understand his travels, right, and how they reflect the experience of much of the Jewish diaspora post the Holocaust. And with this, I would like to jump over to Noah Rosenberg to talk about perhaps first Marianne's experiences upon arriving at Jerusalem, which, thank you so much. And for those of you who weren't here to witness the tour that Noah Rosenberg gave, I learned so much from you. I was very moved by your understanding of his work and where he was as an artist. So I'm really excited to hear more from you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I will share my presentation. Okay, so just a minute. Can everybody see? Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having me to this panel. And an apology in advance, Marianne's suffering didn't end when he arrived to Israel, it increased. So like Piotr started with this certificate that we found in one of the archives, and what was very moving to me, and also I could imagine what the Zionist settlement in Israel, we look at the category of, as you can see, his occupation. You can see here that in his handwriting, maybe he added that his occupation is an art painter. And for a country, or country soon to be, the state of Israel, let's say that art painter wasn't on top priority, especially Maryan, who lost his leg. He came to Israel, he immigrated to Israel, or more accurately saying, he was taken to Israel. He didn't have any Zionist inspiries. It was almost by chance. Like he said it in his own words in one of his few interviews, almost as an insult that he was taken and just left there in Haifa's ports. And then someone else saw his that he didn't have any leg, and the only trade that you can do for this young, again, young country to be is an art painter. So we consider to be second best. So his travel to Israel actually started by him being taken to an elderly and sick, some kind of a camp or a nursery. I think it was outside, also in the north of Israel, and he spent there a whole year. Because the first documentation that we have of Marianne in the art school of Bezalel in 1948. So we missed almost a whole year in Israel that we are not sure where he spent his time or whereabouts. But I think that mostly he was stuck there, considered to be like a second best with all of the other people who couldn't physically build the country. So let's start with the Bezalel Academy. Can you see the next slide? I have some time. Okay, so something that's more optimistic on the surface, of course. So Marianne again was taken. He after a year he received a scholarship. He was of course very poor and didn't know anybody here in Israel. Beside I think one painter who came with him, Yehuda Bekon, which I will tell a little bit about him later on. So Bezalel was actually not a school art per se. It was a national school. It was established in 1906 in one of the Zionist Congress. And what they did here wasn't exactly state of the arts. I think that maybe his situation could be very much different if he was arrived or taken to Tel Aviv. Because in Tel Aviv, Piotr, like you mentioned, that he didn't have the opportunity to see like high arts. Tel Aviv Museum of Art was already existed. It was established in 1932. You have more live art scene. His first director came from Berlin. This is another story to be told. But all of the prominent artists of Berlin was already exhibiting in Tel Aviv Museum of Art, but he was taken to Jerusalem. And as you can see, what I did, I went to the Bezalel archives and took like samples of what the students did in Bezalel during his 2 or 3 years over there. And you can see I will translate what you can't, it's like a socialist realism mostly, who is calling, for example, you can see the graphic poster who calling to young people to sit and to be settlement in the desert. Or you can see on the right, it was of course after 1948, calling like for people to come and visit and travel this new country. Or cover for tefillah, for prayer books, the one here on the wooden one. And another national obsession in Jerusalem during his time of studying over there is painting Yemenites, Jewish Yemenites. And the reason is because the Yemenites, you can see like a whole exhibition, Bezalel National Museum, Jerusalem. So it was actually a place was like it was a school art actually academy, but it was also like the publicity office of Israel in a way. And then the Yemenites, you will show it in a minute in then still Pinchas Burschen and not Marian works, in a way symbolized the original Jew, like the one who is directly connected to the biblical original, especially after the Holocaust. In the Jewish settlement in Israel, of course, they knew about the Holocaust, and something about the Jewish persona, especially the one who came from East Europe, like Pinchas Burstein considered to be, let's say, something to be ashamed of. The fact, and this is, I thought it was common knowledge, Amanda, if we're talking about the gallery talk that we had, but in a way in Israel back in the days, the Holocaust survivor were considered to be guilty in their situation. The saying was that they were like lambs to the slaughter, especially that they don't have healthy minds and healthy bodies. And the nation was obsessed, like every nation, new nation, like in the end of the 19th century, to talk about this new persona. And the new Jewish persona have to be young, strong, beautiful, and productive. Everything that Pinchas Burstein wasn't in a way. So when we're looking at what he did in Betzalel during his year, you can see his work from the period in Betzalel. So you have the official things that he did in Betzalel. I have like to mention, I didn't remark it, not only that the Holocaust survivor in a way considered to be guilty in their situation, not fighting, almost back in the days, one of the main concepts in Israel of the Zionist, one of the more prominent Zionist conception was of the masculine Jew by Max Nordau, I apologize, who brought those theories from Germany about healthy bodies. So of course, Marianne couldn't paint or wouldn't paint openly, publicly, and of course not in Betzalel about his experience in Auschwitz or during the war. He wasn't the only Holocaust survivor. If you are talking about finding your community, so let's say that Marianne didn't find his community in Betzalel. Later on in the letters that he writes to the only art historian in Israel, Miriam Tal, who became his friend and will follow his career and help him to have his own show here in Israel, he writes to a year later, after he left the States of Israel, that he hates all those macho painters that he met in Betzalel, those fighters by day and painters by night. And he became a close friend with two painters. One is Yehuda Bekon, was also a Holocaust survivor. And the other one, Meir Leibner, who knows also as Marianne Merinol, who committed suicide in 1955. So one of the thought of the ideas about him adopting the name Marianne is after Merinol. Marianne Merinol is his friend from Betzalel, but we don't know that for sure. So you can see what he did during his time in Betzalel. And if Piotr mentioned, it was very interesting to hear about what we call the Purim Spiel, about all of those Purim festivities, because in Betzalel they also were obsessed about it. And you can see here like the klezmers, the one that are Betzalel also dealt with those parts. And of course the Yemenites, I think you can see the grotesque humor, or what will be later on the grotesque humor, on the right, on the little hairs on the hands, on the chest, to emphasize a little bit of Orientalism, emphasize that this is a Jew from another diaspora. But in parallel, I think on his own free time, he did paintings of those sorts. Until today, I know I'm shocked to see those paintings and how it leaves all the metaphors behind. Let's say the Holocaust become very almost material, let's say, into our faces. And what is amazing that Yehuda Bekon, one of his closest friends, also an Auschwitz survivor in Betzalel, both of them did those paintings, but didn't publish them at all. So it was interesting, I think, to find out the only exhibition that he had in Israel before we left to Paris. And another thing that I have to say, I have so many things to say, but I don't want to take any more time. I mentioned Miriam Tal. I think that what is wonderful about this Marian journey that I have to say, nobody knows Marianne in Israel. only, even here at the Tel Aviv Museum of Arts, only when the MOCA and Allison approached us to collaborate with this wonderful exhibition, we went to storage, and I found out that in my department, the modern art department, we have over 40 works by Maryan. So it was a complete surprise. He didn't enter to the art history of Israel. Maybe this exhibition will correct it in a way, not to the story of the art history. I hope so. These whole chapters of painters who nobody wants to hear or listen to what they have to say back in the days. Only after the Eichmann trials in 1961, the public heard for the first time openly what those young, brave people went through. It was the first time, and this was the game changer actually in Israel in a way, but say the least, maybe only several decades later. So what we're looking at right now is the exhibition from exactly 72 years ago, January 1950, before Marianne understands that in Israel, he won't be allowed to do exactly what he wants, and saying that he feels that there is like no art scene existing, especially in Jerusalem. So what was interesting to see, you have to understand, it was a very poor country at the beginning, especially to produce an art show. Miriam Tal did the exhibition. She was the curator at the YMCA house in Jerusalem. And what is surprising, I think that this exhibition was made for him to go to Paris with something, because it was in Hebrew, in English, and French. All of the exhibition in Israel back of the days, if you have like a brochure or a pamphlet, were only in Hebrew. You can see a list of the thing that he did here in Israel. And what is surprising to me, that if you will look at the list, take a very quick look at the list, you will see that in a way it's the bottom line of what he did in Israel, Bezalel, and his own private doing of talking about his own experience, or the experience, let's say, of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. And you can see here two things that we didn't find in Israel. So most of the work we know that where they are, and we will be the exhibition in Israel. Look at number 5, for example. It's a number of an Auschwitz-Birkenau survivor. And the question, what did this painting look like? Whose number is it? Is it Marianne's number? So it's almost like, it's a very personal, I remember as a child in Israel seeing a Holocaust survivor with the numbers on their arms, and they always try to hide it until even at the late 80s or 90s. And here you can see a portrait of a number of Auschwitz, which was very surprising, and number 26, couple. So these are like the only 2 works. You don't see Auschwitz-Birkenau or the other works that is Israel. But inside that you see here, like Saadia is a Yemenite name, and Tel Aviv, and the Bible, you can see this whole mixture of a discourse that will become very central in Israel a few decades after Marianne left here without looking back. So this is a period in Israel.
That's incredible to find that. That's incredible. And so, of course, we know that after these moments in Israel, he does travel to Paris. He lives in Paris, which is where he finds Annette, who would later go on to become his wife, and she was a hidden child, correct? Allison, can you speak a little bit towards his time in Paris before we move to Luna?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to thank both Noah and Piotr for their presentations, and just maybe underscore to those who are listening with us today that a lot of what they discussed has never been published on Marianne. This is a lot of new information, and our ambition was always to have a very holistic understanding of Marianne's life and work, because the few publications that were made posthumously about Marianne often very narrowly focused on the questions of the Holocaust or Jewish themes. But in essence, what Noah is speaking about and what Piotr is speaking out, these were very much glossed over chapters of his life. You know, we did not get these deeper understandings of these contexts and also these ambivalences of his experiences, leading up to really where his career takes off in Paris. So he arrives in Paris in 1950. And this is also the kind of crucial moment, especially as it's foregrounded in the exhibition. My name is Marianne. This is when he starts signing his paintings as the single name Marianne. He is truly inventing himself as an artist and as a person. As Amanda mentioned, he met his future wife, Annette, in Paris. And from different oral histories that I have done and things that have been published, you know, I think it was a very, both a remarkable time and a very typical experience of this kind of post-war immigrant artist in Paris, of which we know there were in what is now termed the Second École de Paris, the Paris School. There was many Eastern European Jewish artists who also came to Paris, as well as artists who were there before Paris, who in some ways were an immediate community for Marianne. Very early on, he is patronized by the art dealer Claude Bernard, who is actually remarkably still alive, and he's well into his 90s. Claude Bernard is really a legend, but he bought paintings from Marianne's studio really from his earliest student days. In the exhibition, we have wonderful photographs of them together. Bernard showed artists like, you know, local Parisian artists that were of the post-war, but also Francis Bacon. So this is a really interesting context. And Marianne and his wife was French speaking. So I think that he definitely is able, I think from what we know from his correspondence, he often would prefer to speak French. He spoke French with his wife at home, both in Paris and after. And basically, I think towards the end of the 50s, it's when his career really takes off. We see a shift in his iconography. So as Noah was saying, his early works were really dealing with overtly Jewish themes, the Yemenites, there were a series of rabbis, and then he starts to really find his own visual vocabulary. And he comes up with this term, personnage, or character. So the specific references become more and more embedded into his own visual language. And this is very much documented in the exhibition. And I think the exhibition sort of argues that around 1960, when he has his first show at the Galerie de France, which was maybe like having a show at, you know, like Gagosian, it was a big space, you know, for a platform for living artists. And it was also a gallery that showed artists that although Marianne was never part of an established movement, artists, post-war artists who had shared many affinities with him, like the Cobra artists, like Pierre Alechinsky and others. So he has this breakthrough show in 1960, and he is invited to simultaneously show at Andre Emmerich Gallery in New York. And Marianne was, from his correspondence and different published interviews, we understand that he's very hurt that the French state will not give him citizenship. And when he's given this opportunity to travel to the US, he ultimately decides to take the leap and move there. So he moves to New York in '62, but he had had these previous exhibition experiences, and he joins the Alan Frumkin Gallery, which is significant in a number of ways, especially as we are having this conversation about his diasporic journey, because I would almost say that through that association and arriving in New York, he starts to really find a community, and a community that is not only based on his Jewishness, it's based on common experiences, on artistic affinities. He becomes very close to a number of artists who showed with Frumkin, and even artists that he met in Paris, such as June Leaf, who also showed with the Frumkin Gallery. Frumkin had a gallery in New York and in Chicago, and he championed a kind of, quirky post-war figuration, which a lot of Chicago artists were known for. And in the 50s, really, there was this sort of term of the monster roster that characterized this group of post-war artists. And through June Leaf, through H.C. Westerman, who was another very dear friend of Marianne, who showed at Frumkin, and who shared, he was an artist who had served both in World War II and Korea. I think that this war experience was a point of solidarity with for Marianne. There was Irving Petlin, an artist who, was an on-again, off-again friend, I guess we could say, but also shared Jewish identity and was really a bridge figure between the Parisian art world and the New York and Chicago art worlds for Marianne. So I think Petlin played a big role in his assimilation into the American art world. And what happens to Marianne is, he does become a naturalized American citizen. He and his wife live on the Upper East Side in a kind of very nice bourgeois middle-class apartment, and they live a somewhat normal life. Like going back to what Noah was saying, this idea that the Holocaust subject matter should be, is something that was taboo. It wasn't necessarily writ large. And again, there's a lot of this, these references are more sublimated in the work in the 60s. And then in 1970 around, Marianne really starts to experience these psychic turbulences, this kind of traumatic return of memories, and he becomes under the treatment of a psychiatric doctor. He creates these, when he's in treatment, he, under the encouragement of the doctor, creates a series of drawings, notebooks, which are very autobiographical, and through which we really do start to understand certain facts about Marianne's life and his inner emotional life, of how he's processing his memories of his childhood before the war, his experiences in the camps, even his unhappy marriage, because at that moment he decides to leave his wife after he has this sort of psychic breakdown, and he winds up going to the Chelsea Hotel around 1972. And again, new information that our research has turned up in the process of doing this exhibition. Very little was known really about Marianne's period, his life at the Chelsea, even though that was the place where he made some of his most radical and important work. And I was able to finally connect with someone who was his friend, an Israeli woman, and at the time her husband moved to the Chelsea in 1972, about the same time that Marianne arrived there. And it was really his friendship with the Shomrons, where Marianne starts to find a community with sort of expatriated Israeli creative people. They were sort of hippies. Daniel was an artist and a filmmaker. And it was there that Marianne really is able to start to unpack and explore this painful past, but also to transform it into his great late work, both in terms of the paintings he's making at that time, and most importantly, the film that he created at the Chelsea Ecce Homo, which is in the center of our, not only our exhibition, but really in our rereading of his history, because Ecce Homo is an experimental film in which Marianne really is a precursor to the Shoah testimonial, the film testimonials that are now so precious to us at the USC Shoah Archive. But by decades, he anticipates those testimonials by filming himself, speaking about his experiences, and even theatrically sort of enacting them for the camera, while simultaneously intercutting his own speaking first-person narrative with images that he found, still images from a newswire service. So we see images of the Vietnam War, we see the My Lai massacre, we see images of political figures, religious figures, dictators, and we really posit this film as a kind of crux of his post-war humanism, of where he's really not just saying, this is what happened to me. He's saying, my whole work is about reconstructing what it means to be human and trying to find solidarity and intersectionality with other struggles that are still happening. That, he made that film and he even dubbed it himself an anti-genocide work of art. And he saw that the civil rights struggle or the struggle against the war in Vietnam were one and the same struggle against fascism and against genocide and racism. So, so I think that, unfortunately, Marianne dies an untimely death in 1977, excuse me, at the Chelsea Hotel. After he's made this film, his body, he had numerous heart attacks. He had, all of these psychological and emotional turbulences that he was navigating at the end of his life. And I think that we've been able to sort of piece together his journey as, a Polish Jewish boy born in Poland, who was his world turned upside down, his journey to Israel, his complicated time there, his time in Paris, and then his landing in New York and his sort of experience both as a refugee and as an immigrant. I mean, he's both completely part of a typical diasporic narrative, but also completely atypical. So I hope that, in what we will publish and what you can see in the exhibition, these, these points of his journey are very meaningful to a contemporary audience and audiences who are both from the Jewish diaspora, as well as, the numerous different communities that are in proximity to the museum. So I guess maybe this is a good point to sort of stop and pass to Luna, who's going to speak specifically about the South Florida Jewish community and the diaspora there.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you to our other panelists. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the South Florida connection, but I did also want to share, thinking about Marianne's context in the United States. I know Allison shared a lot of this history, but it's always helpful to see these visuals. And so again, Marianne was showing with the Alan Frumkin Gallery. It had two branches, one that started in Chicago and the other in New York. And through that, he developed some really lovely friendships with people like June Leaf, Leon Golub, and Leon Golub really spearheaded this group, the Monster Roster. So to see some of these visuals, we have here some of the personages that Marianne created, and already here we can see some of these symbols. We have the Star of David, other references, but I wanted to kind of show you these other works that were happening almost in parallel, because there were really these similarities between their practices. And one of the things about the Monster Roster group, I have this great quote from a John Corbett exhibition, it was that they shared this belief that art played a strong role in society. And it had to highlight and make reference to the real harm and gruesomeness present in the world, in the hope that this negativity could be at least a little diminished. So it's interesting to see these works in parallel and to kind of contextualize Marianne's work, because, as Allison mentioned, he didn't want to be pigeonholed as a Holocaust artist, even though in his later years, it became something that came out in his practice. And so I think one of the great things about having this exhibition here, it speaks to this greater conversation around the Jewish diaspora. And we live here in Miami, in a city that has a very high immigrant population. Miami is a majority minority community, but it hasn't always been that way. And I wanted to speak a little bit to that history. So I know we're short on time. I'm coming from the Jewish Museum of Florida, and some of you may have seen this building before. We're located on 3rd and Washington. And the museum itself was the first synagogue on Miami Beach. Our first building was built in 1929, and the second came later in 1936. And I like to start here. I feel like we need to go backwards in order to move forward. And what we see in this image is actually groundbreaking for our second building. And you could just see why they needed it. We had this very large Jewish community. Now, the reason why we're located where we are today is because there were a lot of pioneers and real estate developers that would not sell property to Jews. And that Jewish history also parallels that of other communities in Miami, the Black community, for instance. So really the only place where Jews could buy property during that time was the South of 5th neighborhood, and it was sold to them by the Loomis brothers. So here we have on the left this image of the groundbreaking, but it's also juxtaposed with here a brochure for a hotel, an oceanfront property. And if you look at it closely, what you see are these words up here that say Gentile clientele. And many of these hotels in the area wouldn't allow Jews or people of color to stay. So I think it's important to look at that history, specifically as we get into the post-war years. And so here's an image from the synagogue, from the interior in 1948. And you could see the space is full of people. We have a wedding here. But at that same time, we have, again, Gentiles only, a view about a Jew. This is a flyer for the Essex House Hotel, and we see a refined clientele. And this hotel in particular was designed by the same architect who built the Jewish Museum, Henry Hohauser, who himself was Jewish. So you can imagine you have a Jewish architect who's designing this building, and he himself isn't allowed to stay there. It really isn't until 1952 that an anti-discrimination clause is put in place in Miami. And so places like Belle Isle, different apartment complexes. Here, I think this is interesting documentation from our collection. We have a welcome sign from the KKK, and then this piece from the Anti-Defamation League prohibiting masks and cross burnings. So to look at that history in context of what's happening, there are laws that are passed, but they take time to be put into effect. And the last story I really want to share is one of Bess Meyerson. And so Bess Meyerson was the first and only Jewish Miss America. She was crowned in 1945. And one of the reasons she had entered this pageant was because there were these sponsors that would support. And so when she won the title, there were 3 of the 5 sponsors who pulled out because of her Jewish heritage. And there were a lot of anti-Semitic responses to her winning. And this is coming right off the tail end of the Holocaust. So she later paired up with the Anti-Defamation League and would travel giving this speech called "You Can't Be Beautiful and Hate" around the country. And the last thing I'll also note is that during the war in Miami, because it's so flat on the beach, had an Air Force training base. And so between the period of 1940 and 1950, we see about 140,000 Jews move to Florida because many of them had trained here. So the population in 1940, you have about 25,000 Jews living here locally. And then that jumps to 165,000 because all of these men who came to serve and were placed here to train after the war go north. And that first winter back, when there was so much snow, the weather had shifted, they decided there was a huge migration down south to Florida. So eventually with those migrations, with these laws shifting, the community began leaving Miami Beach and moving to other parts of the city. And today I'll just note that there are around 1 million Jews living in Florida. And Florida itself accounts for about 6% of the Jewish population globally. So thank you all. I'll hand it back to Amanda.
Thank you all so much for coming into the talk today. I think that's really incredible note to end on, of 6% of the Jewish population is here in South Florida. And of course, there's a huge diaspora in New York, as well as many other places. I know Mexico City itself has a large, strong Jewish population. And it's really important to see how Marianne's own travels kind of mimicked the creation of community of the diaspora, right? And each of your faces kind of represents a location of community, right? And as we continue to fight against the ever-present threat of anti-Semitism and the reality of white nationalism, it's important to remember a strength of community that is created through many levels of what Marianne experienced as well: artistic community, these intersectional communities of immigration, and how we can strengthen those bridges and kind of fortify through jointedness. So I wanted to open this up for a chance if anybody has any questions. There is a Q&A option, as well as placing any questions within the chat. Please feel free to. We still have several attendees in here, and like I said in the chat, a recording of this conversation is going to be placed onto the MOCA website as well. For anybody who missed it, we'll also be sharing some more links, because I feel like this is one of those conversations that you can only get when I'm doing a tour of Marianne, right, and kind of talking holistically about this experience, and it's just really exciting to talk about and to discuss, especially here in North Miami, where we have a huge population of immigrants. So we have one Q&A from Oren Steyer, FIU Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Hello, Oren. Thank you so much for joining us. He says, getting back to Ecce Homo, I'm wondering if anyone has any information on how incorporating his own testimony into the film reverberated in his later life and work. So I don't know if you.
Well, it's interesting because the film was made essentially 2 years before he passed away, and I think it's a bit of a complicated answer because the film did go to the Cinémathèque in Paris. We will be having a conversation with Kenny Schneider, who is a artist filmmaker who collaborated with Marianne on the film. And I think this is also an interesting question to pose to him, since he was there when the film was first circulating. I think the film did still remain relatively obscure, and it was somewhat thwarted after his death, because his wife, Annette, who really became the guardian of his work, had very mixed feelings about it. She, first of all, I think really resented a lot of the work, or had at least very ambivalent feelings about a lot of the work he made in the 70s when he lived at the Chelsea, because they were painful to her in that they were no longer living together at that time. And Marianne had a girlfriend who became a protagonist in the work and was sort of part of this like liberation period of his late life. And I think too that as a survivor of the Holocaust herself, and having these kinds of shameful received ideas about how this should not be an identifying label, I think that she kind of carried forth a imperative that the Holocaust should not be really brought up in speaking about his work. So she was not really, I have heard from the curator who worked on the exhibition, the biggest exhibition before ours at 1996 at the Spertus Institute, how his wife was really, she actually kind of withdrew her support for the show over these issues. And I think in speaking to other colleagues and scholars from the Jewish and the Polish Jewish community, it is not uncommon that this kind of repression of the subject matter was often a reflex of survivors. So it's really, I think it's almost very much posthumously that this film became such an impactful way for us to really look at his work, and also in tandem, the notebooks, which reveal so much, because we have his captions and his autobiographical sort of notes on these drawings, where we can really unpack the symbols that recur in the paintings. Like, for example, the kind of always these oral emissions of his personage, which, not that we want to overdetermine the biographical reading, but he repeatedly speaks about how he was vomiting in the camps, because that was his disgust, but also his survival. It was a defense mechanism that he had to sort of separate himself from the abjection that he was witnessing and experiencing. So, it's complicated, this question. And it's still something that's very much part of the debate in this now growing field of Marianne studies.
Absolutely. There's an additional question if we know if any more footage exists from the Ecce Homo that perhaps ended up on the cutting room floor. If there's any, when we have
a really good question. We do not have what we do have, which is again like completely new information, is this still photograph archive that we found at auction in Long Island 2 years before the exhibition opened. And these images are the very images he used to make the film. These are how we were able to identify the source of it was called Black Star, which was the newswire service where he obtained these images from, and there are notes and all these things. So that's kind of very much new information. And in terms of the film, I'm not sure what's in the archive. It's very hard. We haven't had unhindered access to the archive that was left after Marianne and Annette's passing. So hopefully maybe there is more information, but we still haven't accessed it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first comments that I get from this exhibition is that is a lot of work. And so I'm sure there's possibly even more to be found. We have a question also from Danny Polker. Thank you for joining. How does or doesn't Marianne's labor work fit into Polish post-war artistic movements? I want to pose that to Piotr.
If I may, yes, of course, I can answer this question because I find it very important and interesting. So thank you for this question. And short answer is yes, of course, it fits very well in a broader community of Polish Jewish artists. But let me start this answer with more general thought that thinking about these artworks of post-war Polish Jewish artists, we need to go, of course, we need to go beyond traditional way of thinking on art, beyond modernism, avant-garde, novelty, style, aesthetics, all does homogeneous thinking of isms. And what is the most important in this context is circulation of witnesses and socio-political visibility for this kind of activity. And taking this perspective, I find extremely interesting what Noah said in her presentation about unfriendly epistemic climate in the 50s. And in Poland, the situation was somehow maybe not similar, but it was very, very tough as well, because both during the Stalinism period in Poland, it's around 1949 and 1954. So during the Stalinist period and in the late 50s and 60s, the politicization of war memory is huge. So cultural and historical policies were not supportive to the any kind of affirmation of Jewish identity and unique experience of the Holocaust. However, we need to be aware that fighting for Jewish memory was a big part of this cultural field in Poland. For example, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw played a huge role in this process. This institute was headed by the very important art historian Józef Sandel, who did very much to preserve the memory of Jewish artists. And beyond that, we also need to remember that, yes, it's true that a lot of Polish Jewish artists and Polish Jews as a general left Poland, but on the other hand, a large group of prominent Polish Jewish modernism co-created Polish art after 1945. And of course, we don't have much time, but let me just list the most important, one of the most important names. It's for example, Artur Nacht, after the war Nacht Samborski, or Erna Rosenstein, who is now revisited, for example, great exhibition in London this year, Jonas Stern, Henryk Streng, or Alina Shapov. So to sum it up, the experience of war and the Holocaust manifested in various group of works with different aesthetics, and what is also very important, in very different dynamics, because sometimes as early as in the 40s, and it is extremely interesting case of Marek Oberlander, who did so much to increase the visibility of Holocaust as soon as in the 40s and 50s. However, sometimes it goes much later. For instance, a great deal of very important Jonas Stern's work are from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, of course, this answer is very surface, and the subject it's so complex. But as I said in my part, it is important to draw links between Marianne and this very transnational, geographical community of Jewish artists.
And I want to emphasize, Alina Shapov, I did my thesis on queer feminist identity from this artist as well as immigrants' identity. So you talking about these artists that have such a lasting impact, even I know young artists still in school learning from these modernists and artists. So I think that this is another intersectionality that can't be overlooked as well.
I can't agree more. And Alina Shapov is a very interesting example, because unlike Streng, Oberlander, Nacht, and others, she obtained his artistic education not in Poland but in Prague and Paris, and after that she decided to go back in Poland in around 1941, maybe I am wrong, but around that year, and it was her autonomic decision to be part of this artistic and also Jewish community until the late 60s. So very interesting case indeed.
And I love that this is the conversation that spurs forward.
Yes. I just wanted to resonate one thing, because it kind of overlaps with what Piotr is saying, and the last question about the kind of belatedness of the Holocaust as a more upfront subject for artists, and it's particularly artist survivors. Like if you look at the work of an Erna Rosenstein, who stayed in Poland, who was a communist, who witnessed her own parents' murder, escaping from the Łódź ghetto, not the Łódź ghetto, sorry, Lviv ghetto. She really doesn't ever speak overtly about her experiences until she's an old woman. And until after the USC archive came to film her testimony, yet it is in her work, and there are both explicit and implicit places in which her Holocaust experience is acknowledged. But I think that the trigger of 1968, the trigger for Maryan later in his life, where he returns in an explicit way to these subjects, is another point of commonality of Polish Jewish artists who stayed in Poland. This belatedness, relatively speaking, was a very common thing. And I think it also dovetails to what Noah was speaking about, how in Israel, because of the Eichmann trials, because of shifting attitudes sociopolitically, it allowed for more explicit acknowledgements of those experiences and the use of art as a means to address those memories and those experiences.
Absolutely. And I wanted to thank everybody so much. We have a comment from Yochi Yakir. Thank you so much to the panelists and to MOCA Museum for this important presentation. No thanks to you for attending. I also wanted to give Oren a chance to drop a link for the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week program, which we are currently a part of in partnership with FIU. Also, so it's please in the chat, so feel free to see and get more information to register. I also wanted to announce that we will be doing a virtual tour tomorrow in partnership with the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. of the Marianne exhibition. So this is going to be almost like a virtual view into the exhibition. So if you're unable to make it in person to receive a tour, please feel free to tune in, and we will be able to share that registration as well in the chat. And let me see actually if I can copy it in right now. And there we go. It's the longest link, but there it is. If you'd like to register to be a part of that, we'd really love to see you join in. This is an incredible opportunity to get to showcase this amazing exhibition, Allison, to pretty much all of Florida through the Florida Department of Education. And since it is virtual, that means feel free to invite anybody from around the world to participate, because I believe that through this exhibition and through conversations like this, we're really opening up the intersectionality of immigration and the experience of the Jewish diaspora as it moved from place to place. And each place, remember that it has touched, it's built community, it's understanding, building bridges with other diasporic communities as well. And I think that if we continue to share these stories of shared understanding, we can continue to build bridges of strength and of intersectionality and of home that will fight against any oppositions of hate and anti-Semitism and bigotry. So I would like to thank you all again for joining. And with that, I think that we'll end our webinar. Thank you to all of our sponsors and supporters, and thank you again to the City of North Miami for its continued support of our programs. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.